So, today we are with, go for it.
My name is Lori Lowman-Hutson. I live in El Paso, Texas, and I have all my life. I'm a second generation born in El Paso, and my first ancestor that came here came in 1907 and got off the train down at the Union Depot. He came from the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania. I live on the west side of El Paso, and I have all my family here. I have grown up with all my family in El Paso. So I was very rich in having so many family members to help me and to be part of my life growing up. At this point, I don't have the family anymore. They've all passed away except for my children, and my children did not return to El Paso after college. So it's quite a difference now than it was growing up with so much family. I was very fortunate to have my grandparents. I knew my great-grandparents. My parents and my aunt and uncle were so close. We lived in a duplex together at one time, and we ran back and forth between houses and had lots of meals together out in the backyard. And that was wonderful for the first 7 years of my life. Then we moved out to the suburbs. That was close to the city center. We moved out to the suburbs, and I remember lots of barbecues, lots of grilling. We did go to different restaurants, usually on Sundays after church. We went to Gillespie's that was down at the Five Points area. We also went over to Juarez, and El Paso was a dry county in the 1960s when I was young, and my family liked to go to Juarez, and we would go over there. We'd go to La Florida, we would go to Julio's, and in fact, the whole family, grandparents, aunt, uncles, cousins, everyone used to go to Julio's before a minor basketball game or football game, and the border was so open that you had the time to go over there with a large group, have a full dinner, come back across in time to attend a game that started at 7:30. It was wonderful times. We also used to go across the border to buy groceries. There were all kinds of things that you could bring back to the United States. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, especially liked to buy the mangoes. She bought the canned mangoes because I'm not so sure we could bring the fresh, but we would go over at least once a week and buy food in Juarez. Very easy, just cross the bridge and back. Some of my earliest food memories have to do with family gatherings. I've mentioned the grilling and the barbecues. There were also some picnics in the park, and we ate at home most of the time. It was 3 meals a day. My dad was something of a meat and potatoes person, so when I was very young, we did not eat a lot of casseroles. As I got older, casseroles were incorporated into the way that I ate. When I was right out of high school, I married my high school sweetheart, and then obtained a whole nother family who I remain close to, even though my first marriage ended in divorce. With my first marriage, I left the suburbs of El Paso and moved out to the lower valley, quite a distance from the city center, and I learned a whole new way of having to get groceries and cook at that time. When I lived so far from a large grocery store, my choices were to go to Fabens that had a large store or to come on into El Paso. And since I was going to college and my family was in El Paso, that was the thing to do. But you shopped for about a week or two at a time. My husband's family had a packing house. It was the Surratt packing, and we would buy our beef in sides of beef. We also raised pork or pigs, and we had a lot of pork, and so you needed to have a large enough freezer to have all of that food ready. I also learned to cook at that time with a crock pot because I would get up and get dinner ready in the crock pot, leave the farmhouse, drive 30-45 minutes to attend UTEP, and then when I came back at night, dinner was ready. With my first husband's family, I learned some great recipes, and they had lots of family gatherings that were very memorable. But my first mother-in-law, who I'm still friends with, she had a chicken sopa dish and red enchiladas that were, it was green sopa and red enchiladas that were very, very good. She was an excellent cook. And her mother, who came from the Chicago area, she had a recipe that I still use to this day and take to all kinds of family gatherings. It's a zucchini with green chili and cheese, and I got that from my first grandmother-in-law. Then, as time progressed, and as I've mentioned, there was a divorce, so I moved on to getting a divorce and remarrying. And when I remarried, that is when a whole new area of cooking and eating and awakening of my taste buds happened. I want to backtrack a little bit because I wanted to point out that my mother is the one who taught me to cook. So back in my early days, she taught me to cook, and I loved cooking. So she would allow me to cook some of the dinner meals. She allowed me to make cakes. And this is my mother. This is who I learned cooking from, Nancy Lowman. And my father, as I said, did a lot of the grilling, but the other primary person that influenced my early cooking was my maternal grandmother. And she had a wealth of recipes. Her brother was a chef, and she was always in the kitchen. But her kitchen was so small, it wasn't much larger than a modern walk-in closet, that she would not allow people to be in the kitchen with her and cook alongside her. But she did give me many recipes, give me many pointers, and I remember her cooking from a very young age. She would allow me to make cakes with her, but meals, she needed to be free to move around in her tiny kitchen. And her cooking was more, not really Midwestern, but Mid-Atlantic type cooking. She was born and raised in Maryland and Virginia, and so her Thanksgiving meals, the stuffing was white bread with clams. It was very different from living here on the border. My paternal grandmother was raised in the South, and her, as a comparison, her turkey and dressing was a cornbread dressing, more of a traditional Southern stuffing for the turkey. Again, I was very fortunate to have so much family here that on some holidays we went from house to house to house just eating the entire holiday, and it was quite good food at that time. As I mentioned, when I met and married my second husband, my taste buds were really awakened. His family was a real mix of, well, let me back up. My husband, Eric, his father was with the State Department, and they traveled all over the world, but primarily Europe, so not everywhere. But there was an influx of all kinds of different ways of cooking. So they lived in Germany. They then lived in Mexico, and his mother in Guadalajara, and his mother learned all kinds of Mexican and traditional dishes. They lived a very Mexican lifestyle while they were in Guadalajara, and they were in Sweden, they were in Copenhagen, and they were in Moscow for a while. My husband's maternal grandmother was in Helsinki, and so there was a lot of seafood. There was a lot of Scandinavian influences in the way things were prepared and cooked. And then my paternal, my husband's paternal family was from the South, from the deep South, and they were originally from Charleston, South Carolina. His ancestors were some of the first to land in South Carolina, and their cooking was very, very traditional Southern, with some Gula influence as well. That's the Sea Islands influence on the cooking. And my mother-in-law cooked a lot from the Charleston Receipts cookbook from the Junior League of Charleston, and she learned a lot of her Southern dishes from that and from her mother-in-law. So we had the Scandinavian influences. We had a lot of German. There was German nights and German cooking. My mother-in-law also could cook a lot of great Mexican food of all different types, not just border Mexican food. And a lot. Did I say seafood? I think I said seafood, but I had grown up being someone who had not developed the taste buds for seafood. But once I was introduced into their family, I really learned to appreciate everything from crab cakes and shrimp scampi, Charleston shrimp dish, all kinds of other fish dishes. And then one of the things that we did, and it had a lot of fish included, was a Scandinavian meal, and you ate herring. It was pickled herring, and you had the pickled herring with different types of crisp bread and cheeses from Scandinavia. And then my father-in-law would always toast me, and we drank something called aquavit. It's a very strong liquor. You keep it in the refrigerator. It's stronger than drinking straight vodka. We drank it in little thimble glasses. But the tradition was that anytime a gentleman looks at you and says, "Skål," you have to look them in the eye, click your glass or raise your glass, and down the aquavit. Well, after doing it about 2 or 3 times, my father-in-law would have me loosened up for the rest of the night. Very, very good food. Another major influence with my cooking was that my paternal grandparents had a housekeeper who was very much like family and stayed with my grandfather for his entire life. Even though he had lost my grandmother, she died of cancer at a young age. But Maria stayed with my grandfather and was a second daughter to my grandfather. But she cooked wonderful traditional food, and whenever we would go over there, we always asked for Maria's food. If we were going to stay, we would say, "Well, that'll be great, but can Maria cook?" My grandmother was a great cook, but it was very traditional, like what we ate at home. But Maria really made the best tacos, the best enchiladas, the best tortillas. And I did learn my taco recipe from Maria. The family continues to eat her recipe to this day. Here's Maria. And we're just so blessed that we had her influence in our lives. Um, Back to the Scandinavian influences and the meals with my in-laws. One of the things that was very, very wonderful is that my mother-in-law loved to cook. She enjoyed teaching me how to cook. She eventually taught my daughters a lot of cooking. And we would eat dinners at my in-laws' house about 3 times a week, even if it wasn't a special occasion. Special occasions were another way that food really has impacted my life. I've already mentioned that in the younger years with grilling and parties, picnics, but my husband's family always had lots of gatherings, and I really remember sitting around their table, wonderful food, great conversation because of their travels and their experience, and there was always someone else interesting that would be at the table, and we'd have a wonderful experience. My mother-in-law also was very traditional in serving meals by the course. So there would be appetizers as you stood around, and then there would be a first course, usually of some kind of soup. And then there were even meals where we had a fish course and then a regular meat course, followed by cheese and fruit, and then dessert. And my father-in-law was a wine connoisseur, and they were fortunate enough to live in Europe. They met in Paris right after World War II, so he was something of an expert in wines and French wines. So a lot of these special occasions, there would be as many as 5 different wines to drink, and you drank them at different courses in the meal. Sometimes you would start off with champagne with your appetizers, and then there would be some type of a white wine with your first course of soup and your fish course if it was served that way. And then there would be a couple of red wines with the main meal, and one of the reasons we had cheese and fruit and then some kind of fantastic bread was to then sit around, have conversations, and enjoy another wine, another red wine. And then my mother-in-law homemade all of her desserts, and there would be a dessert wine, or the men would want to drink cognac, and the women usually weren't ready for cognac at that time and drank the lighter wine. Although in later years, my mother-in-law did enjoy having some cognac with the guys. Those meals were really special. I learned a lot about serving food and treating a meal very formally, but we also had many informal meals where my in-laws had developed their own spaghetti sauce recipe. While they were living in Paris, they wanted to entertain a lot of their friends, and nobody made a lot of money. This is back in the early 1950s. So they needed a dish that would feed a lot of people and taste fantastic, but be economical. So they developed their own spaghetti sauce recipe. It combined pork and ground beef. It had different vegetables, green pepper, onion, tomatoes, tomato sauce. But their special ingredient, that they're the only ones that I know who have done this, is that they would add 5 or 6 cloves to the large pot of spaghetti sauce. They would let it simmer all day long, and then they could cook as many noodles as would be necessary. Even in our family gatherings, sometimes there would be 2 or 3 pots of noodles being cooked because there were so many people to serve this wonderful spaghetti. And all of our extended family and friends would always love to come to Oma's house for her spaghetti dinners. And those were done very informally, just a lot of fun. And she was the type that would have Chianti bottles to go with the spaghetti, and then even the old Chianti bottles would be on various tables if there were a lot of us, and they'd have the candles in it, just as if you had gone to an Italian restaurant. Those were great times and a lot of fun.
This video thing.
One of my mother-in-law's favorite times of the year was Easter, and she started having large Easter brunches about the time that my husband and his brother married. They would have a lot of their friends for these Easter brunches, and then extended family were invited, including my parents if they wanted to come, other people. But one of the things that she decided to make after I came into the family, or around the time, is that she decided to return to cooking a homemade Easter cheesecake. I'm sorry, I don't know the name. It's a Russian Easter cheesecake, because her family had been in Russia and had to flee at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in the the late 19-teens. Her mother and father escaped over the ice to Finland before she was born. So there were some Russian traditions and Russian recipes, and one of them was this cheesecake. But it took a week basically to make, because you would start it a week ahead, and it was a combination of cottage cheese and cream cheese and sour cream and all kinds of spices, and then it would cook on the stove. Well, first you put it through a meat grinder and ground it all up together. Then you would cook it on the stove and add vanilla and other spices, and then it was poured into a mold. And it was a wooden mold, and then the mold needed to stay upside down in the refrigerator, dripping the juices from the cheese, or the excess fluid, for a week. After that time, you could unmold the cheese, and that photo was unmolding the cheese. And then the cheesecake would look like this. It was something of a pyramid, and you would put a flower in the top. Easter lily is in the top. And then it was eaten with a homemade bread that we also made the recipe, and it was made in coffee cans and baked in the oven with lots of fruit and currants, the dried candied fruit. Anyway, that was a big deal at Easter, and that was a very, very special cheesecake, which would be the centerpiece of Easter. But the rest of it would be a smorgasbord. And it was a smorgasbord of all kinds of different cultures. But smorgasbord is a Scandinavian word, so there were a lot of Scandinavian foods around the table. But there were also the border influences with the Mexican food. There was influences with the Southern cooking, and one of my kids' favorite things was the deviled eggs. And Oma made the best deviled eggs, and my children still make that recipe to this day. It has a little bit of paprika in it, but the secret ingredient is curry. When mixing up the egg yolks, she would put a curry powder in with it, and then put it back into the egg whites. And because of such a large group being there, you needed 3 dozen eggs, because everybody would eat 3, 4. My nephew would eat 5. I mean, there were never enough deviled eggs to go around. We also had a Scandinavian type potato salad, and we had a wonderful Scandinavian mixed vegetable dish that you serve cold. And it's basically the small cut up veggies like you would get in a mixed vegetable, frozen mixed vegetables. It was mini diced onion and just barely any mayonnaise. You could use a dollop of sour cream instead of mayonnaise. Mix it all together, and then put a healthy amount, I mean lots, as much as a cup even, of fresh dill. Dill was a big ingredient at my mother-in-law's house, and that was part of the Scandinavian influence. We had dill on salmon, we had dill on meat patties, and the meat patties were made per her mother's recipe, which with sourdough bread, and then they were patted into something that looked more like a hamburger steak, and fried in butter, lots of butter. And then after you, and you would put the butter and then a little bit of flour so that it had a crispy surrounding on this patty, but not quite as much as a country fried steak or something. And then you'd put sour cream in with the butter, and that was the gravy. You'd serve it with egg noodles, the most wonderful dish, and lots of dill. Lots of dill in the sour cream and butter mixture, which, all of these are very low calorie. You just hold your hand over it and wave, and the calories disappear because it is not, none of this food is low calorie. All of these influences were then part of my children's life. I talk about eating at my mother-in-law's 3 times a week. One of the reasons was both my husband and I worked full-time, and we had children in school by that time. And so my mother-in-law loved to cook, so we were welcome at their house, and we could come straight from work, have a wonderful meal, have family time, and then go home to work on homework or whatever else needed to be accomplished. But all of her cooking greatly influenced my children as well, and some of their fondest memories involve her cooking and her recipes, and the big Easter celebration. There would also be a big Christmas celebration, but it was more formal, whereas the Easter was very informal, and there was always an Easter egg hunt, but the egg hunt at her house involved the small chocolate eggs, and they would hide about 100 eggs all over the house, and of different levels for different ages to find the different chocolate eggs. So my children have very fond memories of that. Another aspect of family gatherings and cooking, and part of my children's memories, is going to my father's house. Now, my father and mother were divorced by the time I was an adult, and my father had a house with a swimming pool, and he loved to grill. But his new wife was an excellent cook in the Southern style, and she always cooked so much food, more than could possibly be eaten at one setting. So he cooked all the meat, and he liked to cook a variety of meats at a time on the grill. And she had all of the Southern vegetables and pies and appetizers, and it was very informally laid out. It was not a formal gathering, and the children could swim all day, and then we would have the best food possible in the evening at those family gatherings. My youngest daughter really wanted to learn cooking. She is something of a foodie, and she paid close attention to anyone who would show her the different recipes, the traditional recipes. And after she was in high school and college, she spent many afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen learning additional recipes. They would try things out together, and then they would eat. And so all of the children have taken these various recipes with them into their adult life. My son-in-law of my middle daughter, his favorite recipe of all that she cooks are Maria's tacos. He says they are the best tacos he's ever had. And my oldest daughter and my son, my only son, they like to grill. My son in particular is something of a grill master and has followed a lot in my father's traditions that way. Some memories of old El Paso as I was growing up involve eating at some various restaurants when we would be anywhere close to the airport, and a lot of times my grandparents would travel and come back into town and we'd meet their plane. Then we'd always go to Elmer's, and Elmer's just recently closed. It was out there where airport takes off from Airways, and Elmer's always had great food. They had a combination of American food and great Mexican food. We loved Elmer's, and I remember Elmer's when it was new, but I've eaten there recently right before it closed, and it was such an old place and very traditional architecture from back in the 1960s. We also ate at a place that was called the Bonanza, and it was where Paisano and Montana meet. And then later on, the Bonanza was torn down and it became Montana Mining at that same place. But the Bonanza was a cafeteria-style steakhouse where you walked in and you placed your steak order, and you've got a salad, and you told them if you wanted baked potato or what, and you'd go sit down, and that was where I learned to love salad, because the Bonanza had the best salads. Later on, when it became Montana Mining, we ate at Montana Mining. That was the first one, and then they opened up another one on the west side. Another place that my family liked to eat that is not there anymore was the Iron Tender, and the Iron Tender had a very special steak soup, along with all kinds of other steak and seafood dishes. We also went out to Cattleman's, but usually that would be someplace that we would take people from out of town as I was growing up. And Leo's was a big one. We would meet my maternal grandparents almost every Friday night at the Leo's at Shellmont. And when my children were little, they were eating red enchiladas from Leo's before they ate a lot of traditional American food, and they loved red enchiladas. As times have changed, one of the things that I noticed that has changed greatly in El Paso is whether you're eating out or you're eating at home, people are making healthier choices, and they're a lot more cognizant, at least the people I know and my children especially, of what they're eating and what the cholesterol is, what the fat is. They're making sure that they're eating healthy. I see a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables in restaurants and in people's homes. They talk about shopping around the perimeter of the grocery store, and most people I know tend to do that and fix their meals that way rather than the processed foods that are on the interior of the store. And it's very embarrassing to me to mention that as I was feeding my children as they grew up, we ate a lot of Hamburger Helper. And I just find it very embarrassing at this point because we maybe ate Hamburger Helper 5 nights out of the week. And it, processed foods, processed chemicals, and ground beef, which ground beef is great, but not every night. But it was a quick meal. It was easy for a mom to come home from work and fix Hamburger Helper and, maybe some canned green beans. And that is not the way people eat today. At least that's not the way my children fix food for their own children. And most of the restaurants now in town are also very sensitive about fresh foods and healthy foods, which is a big change from even the 1980s when I started raising children of my own.
What are some of the restaurants that you normally go to now?
Well, one of our favorite local restaurants, and this isn't necessarily talking health food here, is that my husband and I love Lucy's at the King's X. And my cousins all loved Lucy's at King's X. They don't live here now, but when they come back to town, they always want to go there. So we've gotten to the point that when people come in from out of town and maybe they don't know, maybe they're familiar with El Paso or maybe they haven't lived in El Paso, we take them to Lucy's at the King's X, and it's just really funny because it's a bar and cafe, and so it's something of a dive to take out of town company to eat. But everybody exclaims about it. They love the food, very good food. There's great soup that they serve there before every meal. And it's just a fun, different place to go. We also take people to the state line. We will take them to Cattleman's. But here's the thing. When people come into El Paso from out of town, they always want Mexican food, and they want to eat some traditional Mexican food. Some of them want Tex-Mex. Some people over the years have heard about Leo's and Avala's and want to go there or say, I've heard about it. I've heard stories. Please take me. My children, they've got a list of places they like to go when they come in. They want some charcoaler. They want some Avila's. They want some Lucy's. And in fact, they could go to a different Mexican food place every night if they've come into town. And we find a lot of people that is exactly what they want to do.
Have you eaten at a place called One Grab Community, which is an all plant-based restaurant in El Paso?
I have not eaten there, but I watched the video.
We gotta edit this out. What about buying groceries? Have you seen a change in how in the over your life how you buy your groceries? Is it always stores, or do you used to go to farmer markets or to the person in the corner selling food? How did that experience of buying food has come for you?
When I was younger, you went to the grocery store, but you could also go to just little produce stands, but you had to drive out of town, going to the upper or lower valley, and you could find produce stands, and everybody loved to do that, but it wasn't the typical way that we bought our food. So primarily growing up, it was the grocery store, and my grandmother had a grocery store, a small little store that she could walk to, and the refrigerator and freezer were a walk-in refrigerator and freezer, and that's where you'd get your milk and your eggs and other things. But that era of the small neighborhood grocery store was already changing when I was a kid. Most of my life has been spent at grocery stores. And if you have the opportunity, this is a person has the opportunity for a farmer's market, it's always been fun to get fresh produce at a farmer's market. But as far as a difference between the 1960s, 70s, and now, the only big difference I see is that there's so many bigger chains of grocery store. One of the things my husband and I, though, always loved is we used to visit Austin, and El Paso didn't have a Whole Foods. El Paso didn't have a Sprouts or a Sun Harvest or anything like that. We would go to Austin. We could spend a whole day just in Whole Foods because it was an experience to see all of the different kinds of fresh produce, all the different kinds of meat and seafood, and just the wide variety of cheeses. I mean, the choices were just so phenomenal and so fun to visit and then to buy and try out while we spent time in Austin with our family. And so I know that places like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and Sprouts have changed. They have changed the way that people buy foods. We shop primarily for our produce at Sprouts. We buy a lot of bulk items also instead of all the packaged items. And so that really has changed. But Whole Foods was like going to Disneyland.
Okay. As we come to a close here, are there other stories that you would like to mention to us? And also, I would like to ask, how will you define food? What does food mean to you?
Food to me means family and memories. When I think of food, when I smell certain foods cooking, when I make a recipe that was given to me from someone else, it's all about memories. And it's about family gatherings, family special times, and just thinking about certain food can bring back so many memories of different people. And I know that it has had an impact on future generations. My children and my grandchildren are eating some of the same foods and discussing the same stories and invoking the same memories and traditions in the next generation. And so in a lot of ways, food is about history, but it's also about your future and carrying it forward. And so food is family, is memories, is the past as well as the future for me.